Is there such a thing? And how can you exploit and utilize nature's wealth, at the same time providing the needs of the community without destroying nature? And the second question is the issue of coal. The second I can answer you because renewables cost has declined so rapidly that this technology, whether wind or solar, biomass, even with batteries, is already at grid parity with fossil fuel. And so it's a non-brainer to even say that we favor fossil fuel because in many jurisdictions in the world, including the United Arab Emirates, in the US, in Europe, and in the Philippines, batteries are already slowly becoming available. Renewables, especially solar, is even cheaper than fossil fuel. And even in off-grid areas, even in grid areas, not just in spot areas, diesel, which is double-digit, you could really have cleaner, more reliable, embedded systems if it's solar with batteries and cheaper than bunker or fuel. Perhaps not yet as cheap as coal, but almost there. So that's my answer to your second question. I may or may not be correct, but that would be a good point of discussion in today's conference. And this first question, I'm not an expert in mining, but if there are mines that were not closed, why don't you look at that and see maybe they could be an example, a model for those that were closed. There's a law which is actually an injustice because it does not really give to the government what the government and the communities deserve. But that's the law. Until such time it's amended, and it should be amended so that there's greater benefit to the government and the community. It's not for me to say now. So these two issues which put on the table is so important. And I hope that you, experts in the public and private sector, can discuss that. And I would be happy to receive your outputs. I was looking at all the topics and the speakers today. I wish I did not have session and committee hearings and appointments the whole day and stay and listen to all of you. But in view of that, I could ask a staff to attend, or better yet, if Butch could give me the output and the speeches, soft copy of all of that, so that I could also learn from you, and my decisions and policies can be influenced by whatever transpires today. So Butch Mealy, a good friend of decades, not just of years, thank you for having me here. Mr. Michael Watt, thank you for also inviting me, both the LOREN World Relief Organization and the Tropical Forest Conservation Foundation. Who's from the Tropical Forest Conservation Foundation? I think I've met them many times before because even in my first term, I knew about the bilateral agreement between the US government and the Philippine government that eventually gave birth to this foundation and many others that implemented projects that was born out of the debt condonation for green projects. So the topic today is biodiversity. It's something that is so important because without biodiversity, we would not be here. And it's also something that's so threatened because with a 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, 1/3 of the flora and fauna of the world could be at the risk of extinction. Our biodiversity and the ecosystems that it helps function are essential to all forms of life on Earth. The Philippines is very fortunate because not only is it one of the mega diverse countries, it is also the center of biodiversity, and you've heard this time and time again, as proven in various expeditions where scientists and researchers have been able to discover new and endemic species in our country. In 2015, Terry Gosliner of the California Academy of Sciences led an expedition on the Verde Island Passage and discovered more than 100 species that are likely new to science. This is a quote. Gosliner said, and I quote, The Philippines is jam-packed with diverse and threatened species. It is one of the most astounding regions of biodiversity on Earth. Unquote. Meanwhile, following an expedition in the mountains of northeast Mindanao in 2016, how do you pronounce the name? Is it Rafe Brown of the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute, and I quote, he said, "The terrestrial biodiversity of the Philippines is amazing, and this part of Mindanao is a center of that diversity." These two foreigners don't have to tell us what we already know, what we already have, but they are amazed at their discovery, which we Filipinos are blessed with, which our great minds and brilliant scientists already know, which we already should be protecting through laws, and that's why we have the 1992 NEPAS Act, or the National Integrated Protected Area System, which was enforced by the expanded NEPAS Act, which I sponsored and authored last Congress, which was passed on third reading, but unfortunately not passed in the lower house. But I have filed it again. Hopefully it gets passed this time. So Brown's team discovered a total of 126 species, 40 frogs, 49 lizards, 35 snakes, a freshwater turtle, and a crocodile. We have an abundance of natural resources, but all this wealth is at great risk. Development activities, land degradation, overgrazing, deforestation, mining, pollution, overfishing, construction of fossil fuel activities, including coal, hunting, land use change, and the overuse of fresh water, just some, have pushed ecosystems to the limit. I'm not saying we should be to go back to basics and forget the issues of modernity. But what I'm saying is that we must assess our environment and have an environment impact assessment with very, very high standards so we do not kill what we actually have. Our country has become one of the world's top biodiverse areas. And even as it is gifted, it is also considered a hotspot, with a large number of species threatened with extinction, also because of overpopulation. And I will no longer read the encyclical of Pope Francis, which you already read, and there it is. And we can see how it is so timely, so relevant, and really what he has said about our irretrievable beauty is something which we created ourselves, and we must protect that. If you look around us, the words of the Pope, whether you are Christian or not, Catholic or not, really is a resounding truth. We see truth in these words. So we see that biodiversity is the web of life, but the development around us has caused many to think we can live on our own and disconnect from the web, forgetting that biodiversity feeds and heals, provides us air and water, and is a source of livelihood and recreation. As Butch said, yes, of course, we want and we need clean air. We need clean water. We need our forests. We need our watersheds. That's been a highly used word in the Commission on Appointments on the determination of what a watershed. Should a watershed be declared by law? And if the lawmakers do not declare a watershed, you can abuse it? That does not make sense. The NEPAS of 1992, if it is not expanded and not validated because lawmakers have been remiss in declaring an expanded NEPAS Act, does that mean that you can put coal in a protected area, or a fossil fuel development activity, or mine in a protected area? No. No. So a watershed is a watershed, whether it is proclaimed or not, based on the definition under the Forestry Code and other legislation. Further endangering the precarious situation of our country's biodiversity is a challenge of climate change. Among the projected impacts of climate change is the loss of thousands of species, along with significant changes in the natural ecosystem. The rise in average global temperatures will render many species unable to adapt quickly to these new conditions, or perhaps they will move to regions more suitable for their survival. I already mentioned that according to the IPCC, a 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius rise in the next 50 to 100 years would render 30% of species at risk of extinction. The decline of our ecosystems has been found as one of the underlying drivers of disaster risks and poverty in the context of climate change. As the ill effects of global warming, increased precipitation, and extreme weather events adversely affect the high concentration of species found endemically in our country. We as humans who are dependent on the flora and fauna that make up our natural ecosystems for livelihood and sustenance are directly affected as well. Around 1.6 billion people, including 70 million indigenous people, depend on forests for their livelihood. 2.6 billion people depend directly on agriculture. But 52% of the land used for agriculture is moderately or severely affected by soil degradation. As of 2008, land degradation affected 1.5 billion people globally. Due to drought, desertification, each year 12 million hectares are lost, or 23 hectares per minute. Around 20 million tons of grain could have been grown on this area of land. 74% of the poor are directly affected by land degradation globally. These facts show that we cannot afford to go business as usual because environmental degradation and biodiversity loss are threats to our own survival. In 2015, nations adopted 3 important interlocking agreements. You all know this: the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for DRR. That would save our planet and all species from destruction and death, depending on the level of action we take today. In fact, I believe that in all conferences, in all academic studies, in all policies and legislation, and even in business plans, we should always use Sendai Framework for Action, which knows this very well, our Sustainable Development Goals, everyone knows that, and the provisions of the Paris Agreement. That should be the Bible of environmentalism. That should be at core of how communities should plan their lives and how businesses can actually survive and thrive. The protection of our ecosystems and biodiversity is one of the 17 SDGs. Nations are called to reduce the degradation of natural habitats, to halt the loss of biodiversity, and to protect and prevent the extinction of threatened species. Sendai Framework for Action for DRR calls for ecosystem-based approaches to reducing disaster risk. Studies show, and you know this, for every dollar invested in ecosystems-based disaster and climate change adaptation means saving up to $20 from mitigating and even avoiding the consequences of disasters. That's not original, that's a quote. Protected areas can help protect vulnerable communities and reduce the impact of natural hazards. Mangrove forests serve as buffer against storm surge and tsunami. So imagine we're an archipelago and we have coastal barangays in the 1,632 towns and cities. If we just continue to maintain, protect, and conserve our mangroves. If we continue to plant and not cut the coconut palms, which are natural buffers against windstorms. So natural buffers against storm surge and tsunami for the mangroves, and the natural buffers against windstorms is the coconut palms, and that's endemic to our country. So For climate change mitigation, terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems serve as major carbon stores and sinks as they reduce greenhouse gas emissions from energy production and land use change. The UN Environment Program, World Conservation Monitoring Center estimates that 312, and I can't even imagine this, gigatons of carbon, 15% of the world's terrestrial carbon stock are stored in protected areas. So let's protect them. Let's not abuse it or put extractive, consumptive, destructive development activities in its PAs. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment estimated that 60% of global ecosystem services are degraded, reducing their ability to mitigate the impact of natural hazards. In order to achieve the SDGs, we must take urgent climate action and to build resilience for communities from natural hazards. Faithful compliance to our laws. We have a lot. The NDREAM Law, National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act of 2010. And I'm glad there's a PDRF so that the private sector can really take this to heart. And since the PDRF is populated, can't find a better word, or run or membered by the biggest businesses, industries in the Philippines, then they could really put the NDREAM law at the center of their business planning. Another important law is a People Survival Fund that lays untouched 1 billion pesos a year for communities to access, similar to the Green Climate Fund internationally, and we have our local BSF. So if you have proposals for protected areas, indigenous peoples, for natural systems or natural ecosystems preservation projects, that could all qualify for the People's Survival Fund. As I speak before you today, I am in a very positive mood as the Philippine Senate had just passed on second reading its concurrence with the Paris Agreement last week. And this week, we will hopefully pass on third reading the final Senate concurrence, which means that the whole process of ratification has been completed and the Philippines would be a proud member of the community of nations that have ratified the agreement. That is the instrument of accession given by the Office of the President, last week in my office, Deputy Executive Secretary Maynard Guevara. It was not easy. And having the ratification done by the executive, by the president, and securing the 33 certificates of concurrence of each government department and agency was not easy. But who said things have to be easy? Persistence, patience, clear communication, and conviction, and good intentions. We're also working on several environment bills in the Senate, the expanded NEPAs, which I mentioned, and under these measures, local communities and other stakeholders would have the legal basis and the incentive to participate in the management and protection of areas considered PAs. Representative samples of unique, rare, and threatened species of plants and animals and habitat, including cultural diversity, will better be protected by declaring as national parks the remaining parcels of land under the NEPAs. So I have mentioned all of this, and what you will do today is to answer all the questions lurking in our mind, or probably even improve our policies, or better yet, to help operationalize on the ground the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law, the Renewable Energy Law, the Climate Change Act, the People's Survival Fund, the Environmental Education Awareness Act, even the Mining Act and how it can be improved, and many other pieces of legislation. It would just be ink on paper if the communities who stand to benefit from these important legislation would not be benefited. So I am grateful to organizations such as yours, the PDRF, the Philippine Tropical Forest, and our visiting friends from the LOREN Group to continue to talk and engage, but all of the outputs of today's conference would be to naught if we do not have concrete action on the ground. So the way forward is realizing that the time for talk is over and the time to provide our communities with the resources to operationalize urgent climate action on the ground for indigenous peoples, for rural folks, for the women, for unelectrified barangays in the country, for those who have nothing more than the wealth of the ground by providing them green jobs and sustainable livelihoods. These are the challenges to all of us. The need for energy security, at the same time providing what is clean, affordable, and reliable. The need for jobs in mining communities and protecting the environment and protected areas. But it is not one or the other. In closing, I wish to say to the business community and industry, it makes good environment sense, health sense, and better business sense and economic sense to follow environmental laws. It would be good for business to put DRR at the center of business planning and to follow environmental laws because it would be more profitable in the short, medium, and long term. Because what kind of business or industry or even economy would we have if our mountains were bald? If our rivers and bays were black and polluted? If the air that we breathe was polluted? And if our watersheds were carved out and looked like a sungka? I can't find an English word for the sungka. Carved out, unrehabilitated areas. This is not the kind of earth, of environment, of community that we want to leave as a legacy. And as we've seen in many communities and many countries and many jurisdictions, investments in clean energy provides thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the people are happier, more peaceful. And so it is not one or the other. Economic development can be sustainable and is sustainable. So the pathway towards a clean, resilient, healthy, peaceful community is making sure that CCA, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and disaster risk reduction, and the respect and protection and conservation of biodiversity in our midst is protected, conserved, and respected. With that, I thank you very much for having me here today. I hope I am not misunderstood, and I know that there are those who represent big business. I am not against big business. All I'm saying is that it makes good sense to follow environmental laws. It is for the good of everyone. Thank you very much, and good morning.